was rinsing a chipped teacup when my phone vibrated across the kitchen counter, skittering like a startled beetle. The kettle had just begun its low, steady hum, and the window over the sink showed a cushion of pale fog rolling in from the marsh. It was a soft morning, the kind I saved for writing small things that no one else would read, and then the subject line cut through it: Estate of Alden Laureate, Final Distribution. I dried my hands on the linen towel my grandfather loved because it never left lint, and I opened the email. The words were hard, polished stones. As per the will on record, no portion shall be distributed to Ms. Elara Wynn. The kettle clicked off. In the sudden hush, I realized the clock in the hall had stopped, too, its brass pendulum frozen mid-arc, as if time itself had halted to make room for that sentence. My aunt sent a follow-up text before my mind could catch up: "It's done. Don't embarrass yourself by contesting. Grandpa wanted the house to stay in the family. You're not the family anymore, not really." The screen lit my face with a pale square of light, my reflection ghosted behind the words. "You'd never inherit anything," she told me the night of the wake, her perfume sweet and suffocating. I had tried to laugh then, to say the house had never felt like a prize. I just wanted his desk and the way the floorboards sighed under his step. After the tea cooled and the fog thinned to lace, I walked to the hallway and set the clock's pendulum swinging with a fingertip. It refused to move, caught on something invisible inside. The clock had been my grandfather's anchor, a grandfather clock so literal it made him smile. "Time keeps us honest," he liked to say, tapping the case lightly as we passed to the kitchen, "and honesty keeps time." That morning, it seemed both had left the room. The lawyer's email read like a tidy ending: the seaside house to my aunt and her son, the boat to my Uncle Lionel, the savings, and the collection of rare field journals to be liquidated for maintenance of the property. I pressed the heel of my hand to my sternum until the ache eased. The house on Laurel Cove was more than wood and memory. It was his life's grammar, the pauses, the commas that let us breathe. I'd stayed away for 5 years after a fight that started with a quiet suggestion and ended with a slammed door. I had told him I wanted to leave my corporate job and start a coastal bookshop, small, curious, with tide tables and hand-drawn maps at the register. He said I was running from something unnamed, the way my mother had. I told him I was running towards something he had taught me to love. We never stitched up that tear, we just walked around it, careful not to snag it on our conversations. Now his absence felt like a wound that wouldn't scab. I made tea again only to watch the steam unspool into the stillness. By noon, the fog had burned off and I could see the line of the sandbar where he taught me to read the tide marks, silver, then darker where the eelgrass thickened. I closed my laptop. The house had already begun drifting away in my mind, like a boat someone forgot to tie. At 2, I drove to Laurel Cove anyway. The gravel popped under my tires with the same stubborn music, and the salt wind knifed through my sweater on the porch. The brass key still fit. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar oil and lemon peel, the way he kept it, a small ship held together by polish and order. My aunt had left a note on the hall table: "We'll be cataloging this weekend. Take your things today." My things. As if anything here could be claimed without claiming the hand that made it matter. I walked the circuit he used to walk, fingertips grazing the chair backs, the banister, the edge of the desk with the burn marks shaped like a tiny crescent moon. I stopped in front of the clock. The pendulum was still, but now I heard what it had masked for years: the low hush of the ocean through the cracked window sashes, the distant cry of gulls stitching the sky. In the glass, my reflection looked steadier than I felt. 32 and already tired of fighting about what counted. My mother taught me to travel light. My grandfather taught me to keep a ledger of small, honorable acts. Somewhere between the two was the life I had wanted to make. I set my palm flat against the clock's wooden case. The wood was cool, faintly ridged. "You said time keeps us honest," I murmured, the words catching in my throat. "Then let it be honest with me." The house made a settling sound, old timbers adjusting to the afternoon. I took the note from the table and slid it under the paperweight on his desk. I could have fought right away, called the lawyer, demanded language and dates, but the morning had said all it needed to say. They had written me out of the last sentence. I told myself I would take a box of books, a sweater that still kept the shape of his shoulders, and leave before I was tempted to argue with a ghost. I climbed the stairs. In his bedroom, a square of light lay across the floor, soft as a folded shirt. A tide chart was pinned above his bureau with tiny brass tacks, this week's dates circled in pencil as if he still meant to align his days with the water's breath. Something tightened under my ribs. I opened the top drawer to find the linen handkerchiefs he favored, the corners embroidered with the initials AL in thread the color of tea. The second drawer held cufflinks, smooth as river stones. The third drawer stuck, exactly as it did when I was little. I braced my thumb against the carved edge and eased. The drawer came free with a sigh, revealing a velvet pouch and a small brass key I had never seen. The key was old but polished, the head of it cut into the shape of a laurel leaf. I rolled it into my palm, a cool weight that suddenly didn't feel like nothing. Somewhere below, a door closed, the wind, I told myself, even as my pulse quickened. I slipped the key into my pocket and closed the drawers in reverse order, the rhythm of hiding setting my breath back into its rails. When I returned to the hall, the clock's face caught the light and threw it back at me in a thin band that ran across the floor like a path. I stood in that band and listened to the silence until I could hear the kettle again, the one I hadn't turned on, the one in my memory. I had come to pack a box and leave. Instead, I had found an old key shaped like the name of this cove. I didn't know what lock it belonged to. But as I locked the front door behind me and felt the salt dry on my lips, I knew the day had shifted. I hadn't accepted the sentence they would write for me. Time, at least, was still mine to keep. The next morning arrived gray and damp, the kind of weather that flattens sound and makes a room feel like a held breath. I took the bus to the library because the car felt too loud for what I needed to think. I tucked myself into a window seat and watched as the town unspooled, paint peeling from porch rails, a boy in a yellow slicker dragging his backpack along the curb, the coffee shop where the barista still drew a foam fern on my latte and called me book girl without irony. What I risked losing wasn't only the house or the memory of it. It was a way of narrating myself. My grandfather's name had always been a spine I could align with. He taught me to oil a cutting board until it gleamed, to fold a map along its original crease, to keep a pencil behind my ear. Careful is not the same as afraid, he would say, and I believed him. But now the people who shared my blood were arranging me in a story where I was careless, unreliable, a drifter who didn't deserve the oak table I learned my letters upon. My Aunt Noreen had a gift for curation. She could stage a breakfast and make it look like the house woke up smiling. She could also stage a narrative. At the wake she had stood at the head of the room like an anchor and told 100 guests how Alden Laureate always meant for his worldly goods to consolidate for the sake of stability and stewardship. The words clicked neatly into place. People nodded, sipped, dabbed the corners of their eyes. My cousin Mara moved through the room refilling glasses like a trained echo. Uncle Lionel had haunted the edges, his mouth turned down as if rehearsing disappointment. He and my grandfather had never agreed about boats. My grandfather loved little ones that could be muscled along by a single determined person, while Lionel favored loud, heavy things that churned the water until it looked like it had been overworked. He didn't like the way I spoke about the cove as if it had moods and rights. "It's a coastline, not a person," he once said, and Grandpa had cleared his throat, the move he used when he wanted someone to consider the possibility of being wrong. Financially, I was not on strong ground. I had left the job with the glossy elevator and the coffee stirred by a tiny robot arm. I was freelancing, piecing together grant applications and website copy for local businesses. My rent in the converted boathouse by the canal was cheap because the landlord liked me to water his succulents. I had scraped enough for a used computer that didn't whine under effort. The dream of a bookshop had been folded and unfolded so many times it felt thin in my hands. What I could not admit to anyone, not even to the old kettle that saw me through, was that the house had been more than a set of rooms. It might have been a beginning again, a place where I could open the door to strangers and ask, "What do you like to read about tides?" The legal email reduced all of that to a tidy, "Not yours." I printed it, because paper made threats easier to measure. I folded it into my notebook with the other small papers that kept my days in order: grocery lists, a page from last month's tide table, a receipt where someone had drawn a smiley face instead of a zero. In the library's quiet, I read about probate court. Words like codicil and a holographic will took on the sheen of possibility, but they also pressed their cost against my ribs. Contesting would mean being the noisy one, the difficult woman who refused to accept what everyone had decided together. I thought about my mother in photographs, always almost out of frame, the corner of her smile visible, a shoulder turned as if already walking out of the picture. She had never asked for anything with her name on it. She would tell me to take my box of books and go. But my grandfather had taught me to inventory a pantry with accuracy, to name what we had and what we needed. Justice, like flour, should be measured, not imagined. It sounded like him. It also sounded like the hollow thing in my chest that had kept me awake most of the night. On the walk home, the rain sharpened and the harbor bells sounded both near and far, a layered sound like memory itself. I detoured past the cove. The Laureate house sat square and watchful at the point, shutters blinking salt, roofline straight as a sentence. In the window of the study, I saw the clock face. The hands were still at 12 and 9. I could picture the key in my pocket, warmed by my palm through the fabric. Noreen and Mara would be there this weekend with their clipboards and benevolent smiles. Lionel would bring a toolbox and a sigh. They would catalog the house into something manageable, and I would not be allowed to name the weather. The phone buzzed. A message from Mara: "Hey cuz. We'll be at the house Saturday to sort. You can grab your stuff then." Grandpa wanted minimal fuss. It was almost tender, the way she phrased it, as if she could see me from the other side of the glass and wanted to pat my arm. I typed and erased 3 responses. Finally, I wrote, "I'll come before you start. There are a few things I want to find." In the boathouse that evening, I lined up what mattered on the table: my notebook, the printed email, the key with the laurel leaf head, and a photograph I kept tucked in my wallet, a picture of Grandpa at the cove, sleeves rolled, his thumbs hooked into his back pockets, the tide inching toward his ankles. In the lower corner, almost lost in glare, was the clock face in the study window, lit like a coin. I sharpened a pencil with slow, satisfying turns. Then I made 2 lists. The first I titled Losses: the house, the garden where dill shot up like green fireworks, the cedar chest that smelled like winter, the carved whale over the kitchen door, belonging. The second I titled Answers. I left it blank and pressed the pencil to the page until the point dented a dot that I could feel from the other side. My grandfather would have told me to count all the way through. "Even what you don't know is part of the record," he'd say. When the rain let up, I walked to the water's edge and stood with the key in my pocket, rubbing the ridges with my thumb as if I could produce an answer from friction. The tide was going out, smoothing the sand flat as a palm. The sky above me emptied of color. "Careful is not the same as afraid," I said into the quiet. I was careful. I was also a little afraid. By the time I crawled into bed, the lists had multiplied in my head: new columns, sub-entries, annotations in the margins. Grief makes a bureaucrat of you, and betrayal gives you a ruler to draw lines. I dreamed of the clock, its case opening like a door to the narrow path of light I had stood in. When I woke, the light in the window was the color of paper just before ink touches it. The day waited. I placed the key on my tongue for the barest second, tasting metal and old polish, as if it were sacrament. Then I slipped it back into my pocket and started the walk to the house before anyone else could claim the morning. The house met me with a hush so complete it felt scripted. I unlocked the front door and stood just inside, listening for another presence, pipe settling, a drawer pulling and closing, but only the ocean spoke, low syllables through the seams. I moved through the rooms with the attention I used to give to proofreading contracts, letting my eyes pick up small irregularities, a hairline crack in the trim that hadn't been there last spring, a scuff on the stair where a box had snagged, the dullness on the banister where hands never touched. In the study, dust motes turned lazily in a shaft of light. The clock's face pinned them like punctuation in a sentence. I knelt on the rug and pressed a hand to the baseboard. When I was 8, Grandpa had called me his house ferret for the way I loved to find what the house had misplaced, the stub of a carpenter's pencil behind the radiator, the fossilized beetle under the draft stopper. The clock case had a nick on the right side near the base, a crescent like the burn on his desk. I traced it and felt, beneath the varnish, the suggestion of a panel. I should call a locksmith, I thought. I should call the lawyer with the clean email signature and ask to see the will. Instead, I pressed my ear to the wood and heard my own breath. The brass key in my pocket felt heavier than its size allowed. I crouched and looked at the clock from a child's angle. Then I saw it, not a keyhole, exactly, but a tiny, leaf-shaped impression within the carvings at the base, so subtle you'd need to know what you were looking for to find it. The key slid into that leaf without resistance. I held the head between two fingers and waited for a feeling to rise, fear, triumph, a sudden cold. Nothing came. I turned the key a quarter inch to the right. The panel at the base gave a sigh that seemed to exhale the last year of my life. Inside the shallow compartment lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, a stack of photographs bound with twine, and a folded letter with my name on it in my grandfather's neat, slanted print. I sat back on my heels and closed my eyes. For a long beat the only sound was the blood in my ears and the faint click of the brass chain against the pendulum, though the pendulum hadn't moved in days. I unwrapped the oilcloth first. Inside was a document sealed with red wax and a notary's stamp, the words, "Codicil to the last will and testament of Alden Laureate," printed at the top. The date at the upper right corner was 8 months after the will my aunt had quoted at the wake. My mouth dried so quickly the paper seemed to drink the moisture from me. I scanned the text. In a tone so spare it felt like a poem, he amended the distribution, the residence at Laurel Cove to pass to my granddaughter, Elara Wynn, in trust for the purposes of literacy, shoreline stewardship, and community use, with the following instructions. Below, in a numbered list, he set terms, that the house host a reading room 2 afternoons a week, that a small fund be established for students to learn to chart by hand, that the garden be maintained as a pollinator refuge. He wrote, in the simple gravity he used when instructing me how to coil a rope, "Keep the house open, and the tide will come to you." The letter with my name was not long. He apologized for letting pride speak in the place of care after our argument. He admitted that he'd been frightened by what my leaving stirred in him, memories of my mother taking the early train, of rooms emptied before he could name what was leaving. "You are not a repetition," he wrote. "You are an echo that makes the first sound clearer." He told me he loved the way I read the margins, the shoreline of any rule where the interesting life happens. Then, in a sentence that landed softly and rearranged how I was holding myself, he added, "If you find this, it means I trusted the right person to listen for it." I didn't cry exactly. The tears felt like condensation on a glass, appearing without fuss and sliding down the sides of the day. I read the codicil again. The witness names at the bottom startled me, Lucille Peralta, ESQ, and a second signature I knew from the hardware store receipts, Mr. Bain, the notary who wore a watch chain and liked to discuss kayaks. Not a mystery, then. Not an improvisation. It was legal, deliberate, witnessed by hands that still lived in this town. The photographs under the twine were of the house across different winters, snow pinned in the corners of windows, a scarf of frost along the eaves. In one, my grandfather stood with Noreen and Lionel on the porch, each of them turned slightly away. On the back of that one he'd written, "We can all look but not all of us will see." On the final photograph, he had written a single word, "You." The house sounded different after I closed the compartment, as if the boards had shifted into a more honest alignment. My phone lay silent on the desk where I'd set it face down. I turned it over and opened a new message to Mara and Noreen. "I found something in the study that bears on the distribution," I wrote. "I'll bring it to Ms. Peralta's office this afternoon." I left Lionel off the message because the thought of his sigh in my ear just then felt like a stone in a shoe. Lucille Peralta had taken over the town's most respected practice 2 years earlier. She was one of those people who made competence look like a form of ease. When I called, her assistant told me to come in at 3. The clock in the study, still unbudged, read 1:40 as I gathered the oilcloth-wrapped document and the letter. I tucked the photographs into my notebook pocket and slid the laurel key onto the chain around my neck, where it rested against my collarbone like a warm thought. The walk to Ms. Peralta's office took 15 minutes. Along the way, I bought a small bag of lemon drops from the pharmacy, my grandfather's favorite, sharp sweet on the tongue. The sky was the matte gray of a river stone. I kept one palm on the folder, feeling the edges through the canvas of my tote as if it were a small animal that might startle and run. Her office smelled like ginger tea and printer ink. She read the codicil with her mouth a flat, thoughtful line, not interrupting herself to nibble at good news, as some people do. When she finished, she lifted her eyes to mine as if she were stepping from a dark room to a porch full of light. "I witnessed this," she said quietly. "I remember this day." He was particular about the language and very clear in his intentions. The email I had printed from the other lawyer looked humble next to the codicil seal. "So what happened?" I asked, the question small but edged. "Either incompetence," she said, "or concealment. The will on record is valid, but this supersedes it where specified. We'll file an emergency petition with probate. The judge isn't one for spectacle. He'll look at the date and the signatures. He'll look at me. And we'll see." I set the letter on her desk but didn't tell her what it said. "Some words are ours to carry. Be ready," she added, "for people to decide who you are before you walk in the room. Keep your voice low. Let the paper do the louder part." On my way out, I caught my reflection in the office's narrow mirror. I looked like someone who could open a door and hold it, who could say, "Come in. We're open 2 afternoons a week." Outside, the wind threaded itself through the flags on the wharf until the fabric hummed. The house was waiting. The tide had already turned. In my pocket, a lemon drop clicked against the laurel key and made a sound like agreement. Probate court lived in a brick building that took the light politely, as if it didn't want to make a fuss. On the morning of the hearing, the hallway smelled faintly of floor wax and rain. I sat on a polished bench and watched people move with the careful choreography of those who know what paper can do. Noreen and Mara entered first, their raincoats the color of watered lilies, their faces set to a civility I recognized from holiday tables. Lionel followed in a dark jacket he probably wore to weddings and wars. His eyes flicked over me and away, as if I were a misplaced receipt. When he saw Miss Peralta, he blinked and recalibrated. Inside the small courtroom, we rose and sat and rose again. The judge wore the expression of a man who trusts the day to be complicated whether he smiles or not. Miss Peralta spoke first, her voice even, her outline of the codicil so spare that the room didn't have anything extra to carry. She offered the sealed document and her own signature as witness. She cited the date, the notary, the language of intention. She did not use adjectives where a noun would do. The other side's attorney, haired fast, a little shiny, argued that the codicil had not been presented at the initial filing and therefore could not be trusted. "Convenient," he said at one point, his mouth shaping the word like a mint he didn't like the taste of. Lionel's jaw bunched. Noreen tightened her grip on her bag. Mara's eyes landed on me and then skittered off, as if my face were a bright thing in a drawer that you can't look at for long. I thought about what Miss Peralta had told me, let the paper do the louder part. I didn't speak. I opened my notebook and slid the photographs from the pocket, placing them face down on my lap, my thumb finding the corner of the card where the word, "you," was written. I pictured the reading room the codicil demanded, the sound of a pencil scratching tied notes in the margins. When the judge asked if I had anything to add, I stood and approached with the lemon drop calm I had rehearsed. I presented the letter without reading it aloud. "It is personal," I said, my voice steady. "But it speaks to intent." He nodded and handed it back, and for a strange second I imagined the letter was a small bird we had both held and then returned to its tree. He asked about the clock. I described the hidden panel and the laurel leaf key. I did not dramatize. I admitted I had not known about the compartment as a child and only found it after his death. The judge made a light note with his pen, a single diagonal slash. When he spoke his decision, it sounded like rain on slate, unemotional, undeniable. The codicil, duly executed and witnessed, controlled the disposition of the house and the conditions described therein. Any prior distribution regarding the residence was superseded. He ordered the property to transfer to the trust under Ms. Peralta's fiduciary oversight, pending routine formalities. He also inquired, with the quiet interest of a man who collects stamps, how a duly executed codicil had failed to appear in the initial filing. The other attorney swallowed. Lionel's sigh finally found the air and sat in it, heavy. Outside, the rain had slowed to a fine thread. On the steps, Noreen faced me with an expression that landed somewhere between apology and calculation. "You should have told us," she said gently, as if we were discussing a changed dinner reservation. "We could have handled this without court." "You told me I'd never inherit anything," I replied, soft so it wouldn't carry. "I believed you. For a little while." Mara touched my elbow, a fleeting pressure that said later, "Perhaps, we will make peace in some small kitchen with the radio on." Lionel's voice reached for a height it couldn't hold. "He meant for the house to be managed," he said. "You don't manage." "I tend," I said, because the word felt more honest in my mouth. "And I keep time." We didn't argue. It was raining, and the town had errands. Ms. Peralta shook my hand and said she'd send the trust paperwork and a list of practical items, insurance, plumbing, the state of the roof. Then she added, "You'll need to hire people. A reading room doesn't dust itself." It sounded like permission dressed as advice. By afternoon, I was back in the house. The air had the wet leaf smell that seeps into wood and lingers in the slow corners. I opened windows and let the ocean louder. I set the clock's pendulum swinging. For a second it moved, then hesitated, then committed. The ticking filled the study like an animal coming back to its body. I put a kettle on and unfolded a card table in the front room, setting out 3 stacks: keep, share, give. For share, I set aside the blue dishes Noreen loved. For give, the brass lamp Lionel swore had come from a ship that never existed. For keep, the ledger where my grandfather noted which birds arrived on which wind. I found twine in the drawer and tied the photographs back into a bundle, slipping the one that said "you" into my pocket. Near dusk, I wrote a single note and taped it to the front door: "Reading room open soon. 2 afternoons a week. If you have a Tide story, bring it." I printed it on plain paper with a pencil, the letters firm, no ornament. The sign looked like it might have always been there. It looked like a promise a house could keep. Night found me at the kitchen table with the trust documents. Paperwork, like tides, obeys its own moon. I initialed here and there with a sense of arranging furniture in a room that had always been mine but had needed me to turn the lamp on. I thought of my grandfather's letter, how he wrote that I was an echo that made the first sound clearer. Quiet justice is mostly echo, what was intended returning to the shore in the shape it deserves. At the back of the clock, I set the laurel key on a hook I hadn't noticed in the compartment, a slim circle that fit the key as neatly as a word into a sentence. The ticking of the house kept time with my breath. For the first time in a year, I fell asleep without negotiating with the dark. Morning unrolled like a piece of linen across the table, clean, bright, faintly textured by what had come before. The ocean outside was a low blue, the sort that makes you swear someone ironed the weather overnight. I brewed coffee in the old enamel pot because the machine hissed in a way that felt impatient, and impatience no longer belonged here. I started the practical work. The reading room wanted chairs that didn't squeak and a rug that wouldn't make ankles itch. I called the school to ask whether anyone needed community hours and could be bribed with muffins to help carry boxes. I stood in the garden with the codicil's instructions in my pocket and looked for a place to tuck a laurel sapling. The dirt smelled like rain, metallic and generous. People arrived as if the sign on the door had rung a bell inside their own houses. Mr. Bain came first in his pressed shirt, watch chain neat, carrying a stack of old notary seals he thought would make charming paperweights for the children. He apologized in a roundabout way for not asking more questions when the first will was filed. "We trust what we think we know," he said, eyes on the window, where the salt air wrote and unwrote itself. "And sometimes we forget to turn the page." Mara appeared mid-morning with a box of spoons and 3 jars of clover honey. "Don't ask me why," she said, setting them on the counter, her voice a little ashamed, a little relieved. "It just felt right. Also, that lamp Lionel loves was never on a ship." She rolled her eyes in a way that had made me love her when we were 9. We hugged in that awkward way of people who have been holding their breath for too long and have to learn how to release it a little at a time. Noreen sent a message that was almost kind. "I shouldn't have said never," she wrote. "We said a lot of things that day." The line sat like a folded napkin beside a plate, neither apology nor invitation, but set out with care. I answered with a picture of the reading room, sunlight spreading over the table, a stack of field journals fan like shells, and wrote, "We're open on Thursdays. Bring a story." She sent a single heart, not red but that new soft color apps use, as if to say we are practicing gentleness in a place that doesn't always reward it. I called the shop Low Tide and Laurel. The hand-painted sign swung from a bracket that had held a porch lantern for decades. Children came with damp hair and earnest faces, teenagers came because there was a quiet power in choosing a seat and pretending you didn't care, and people my grandfather's age came and sat with their hands folded, as if they were about to remember something carefully. We charted the cove by hand with pencils that left graphite moons on our fingertips. We read paragraphs aloud that held small truths without fanfare. We kept time together. On the second Thursday, a storm pressed in from the east. The windows thrummed. A woman arrived with a cardboard envelope blistered at the edges from years in a closet. Inside was a photograph of the shoreline 50 years earlier, the eelgrass thick as hair, the sandbar higher. We laid it on the table and considered it the way you consider a map to a place you have always lived but want to see with a stranger's eyes. The house seemed to take a breath and hold it, the way it had when the codicil lay on the desk and changed the slope of the floor. Some evenings, I read my grandfather's letter again. I didn't need to, but the word sat me down in the chair across from him and let us talk about the weather without pretending it was only weather. I kept the laurel key on its slim hook. The clock's ticking grew confident. Once, when I placed my ear briefly against the wood, the sound moved through bone, and I had the peculiar feeling that my skull and the clock's case had agreed to be one instrument for a moment. "Time keeps us honest," he said. "Honesty keeps time." What changed within me was not the fact of owning a house. It was the loosening of a clenched narrative. I was not the person who misses the last train or the woman who is always almost in the frame. I was someone who turned a small brass key and found proof that intention can be patient and not any less true. The town would still tell its tidy stories, the ones where inheritance is about blood and not the work you do when no one is watching, but now there was a reading room where a different story could be told in graphite and breath. I wrote a letter of my own and slid it into the compartment behind the clock, under the photographs and the codicil, where it would rest against the wood like a steady hand. In it, I listed everything the house had taught me in a season, that a door open to strangers changes the way air moves in a room, that the smell of lemon oil is a sentence that says keep going, that justice that arrives quietly is not less justice, that forgiving someone does not require letting go of what you owe to yourself. I planted the laurel sapling near the kitchen window where the morning light rests its warm palm. I set a flat stone at its base and wrote the date with a carpenter's pencil, letting the graphite darken the grooves. The wind lifted the leaves and showed me their pale undersides, a soft flash like fish in the shallows. Grow, I said, because sometimes speaking the obvious into a new space makes it truer. On the first calm night after the storm, I walked to the sandbar and listened to the cove mend the ragged edge the wind had chewed. The moon balanced itself on the lip of the horizon like a coin. Behind me, the house kept time. In front of me, the tide negotiated with the shore in the old language it never bothers to translate. I thought of my mother, her shoulder turned in all those photos. I wished her a letter like mine. I wished her a room where someone would hand her a pencil and a tide chart and say, "It's not too late to learn the shoreline." When I returned, I found a note tucked under the door. The handwriting was careful, as if drawn with a ruler. I was wrong, Lionel had written in wider loops than I expected. About boats, about managing, about other things I won't name because they're too many. If there's a shelf here for a brass lamp that never saw a ship, I'll bring it Saturday and carry in the chairs. The house did not laugh. The house let the note sit beside the lemons, and I let it sit there, too, as if we both understood that some bridges are best built without watching. That night, I lay awake only because the owls were busy and interesting. I placed my palm flat on the quilt, feeling the small vibrations the clock sent through the floorboards, the way a ticker tape of the house's breathing might feel if you could run your thumb along it. I whispered thank you into the room, not to anyone in particular and to everyone who had entered and kept their voice low. In the morning, I would sweep the sand off the porch and open the door. The sign would move lightly in the breeze, the word Laurel spelling itself again and again, patient as the tide. No one would ever write me out of the last sentence again. I was the one who would decide when the period landed, and what came after was not an ending but a resting place for breath before we began again.